the Peace of 1748, Acadia had been ceded to England. But the French still claimed a large portion of it, and built forts for its defence. In 1755, these forts were taken, and the whole of Acadia was conquered, by 3,000 men from Massachusetts, under the command of General Winslow. The inhabitants were accused of supplying the French with provisions, and of doing other things that violated their neutrality. These accusations were probably true, observed Grandfather, for the Acadians were descended from the French, and had the same friendly feelings towards them, that the people of Massachusetts had for the English. But their punishment was severe. The English determined to tear these poor people from their native homes and scatter them abroad. The Acadians were about 7,000 in number. A considerable part of them were made prisoners, and transported to the English colonies. All their dwellings and churches were burnt, their cattle were killed, and the whole country was laid waste, so that none of them might find shelter or food in their old homes, after the departure of the English. 1,000 of the prisoners were sent to Massachusetts, and Grandfather allowed his fancy to follow them thither, and tried to give his auditors an idea of their situation. We shall call this passage the story of the Acadian exiles. A sad day it was for the poor Acadians, when the armed soldiers drove them, at the point of the bayonet, down to the sea-shore. Very sad were they, likewise, while tossing upon the ocean, in the crowded transport vessels. But, methinks, it must have been sadder still, when they were landed on the Long Wharf, in Boston, and left to themselves, on a foreign strand. Then, probably, they huddled together, and looked into one another's faces for the comfort which was not there. Hitherto, they had been confined on board of separate vessels, so that they could not tell whether their relatives and friends were prisoners along with them. But, now, at least, they could tell that many had been left behind, or transported to other regions. Now, a desolate wife might be heard calling for her husband. He, alas, had gone, she knew not whither, or perhaps had fled into the woods of Acadia, and had now returned to weep over the ashes of their dwelling. An aged widow was crying out, in a querulous, lamentable tone, for her son, whose affectionate toil had supported her for many a year. He was not in the crowd of exiles, and what could this aged widow do but sink down and die? Young men and maidens, whose hearts had been torn asunder by separation, had hoped, during the voyage, to meet their beloved ones at its close. Now, they began to feel that they were separated forever. And, perhaps, a lonesome little girl, a golden-haired child of 5 years old, the very picture of our little Alice, was weeping and wailing for her mother, and found not a soul to give her a kind word. Oh, how many broken bonds of affection were here! Country lost, friends lost, their rural wealth of cottage, field, and herds, all lost together. Every tie between these poor exiles and the world seemed to be cut off at once. They must have regretted that they had not died before their exile, for even the English would not have been so pitiless as to deny them graves in their native soil. The dead were happy, for they were not exiles. While they thus stood upon the wharf, the curiosity and inquisitiveness of the New England people would naturally lead them into the midst of the poor Acadians. Prying busy bodies thrust their heads into the circle, wherever 2 or 3 of the exiles were conversing together. How puzzled did they look, at the outlandish sound of the French tongue. There were seen the New England women, too. They had just come out of their warm, safe homes, where everything was regular and comfortable, and where their husbands and children would be with them at nightfall. Surely, they could pity the wretched wives and mothers of Acadia. Or, did the sign of the cross, which the Acadians continually made upon their breasts, and which was abhorred by the descendants of the Puritans, did that sign exclude all pity? Among the spectators, too, was the noisy brood of Boston school boys, who came running, with laughter and shouts, to gaze at this crowd of oddly dressed foreigners. At first they danced and capered around them, full of merriment and mischief. But the despair of the Acadians soon had its effect upon these thoughtless lads, and melted them into tearful sympathy. At a little distance from the throng, might be seen the wealthy and pompous merchants, whose warehouses stood on Long Wharf. It was difficult to touch these rich men's hearts, for they had all the comforts of the world at their command, and when they walked abroad, their feelings were seldom moved, except by the roughness of the pavement, irritating their gouty toes. Leaning upon their gold-headed canes, they watched the scene with an aspect of composure. But, let us hope, they distributed some of their superfluous coin among these hapless exiles, to purchase food and a night's lodging. After standing a long time at the end of the wharf, gazing seaward, as if to catch a glimpse of their lost Acadia, the strangers began to stray into the town. They went, we will suppose, in parties and groups, here 100, there a score, there 10, there 3 or 4, who possessed some bond of unity among themselves. Here and there was one, who, utterly desolate, stole away by himself, seeking no companionship. Whither did they go? I imagine them wandering about the streets, telling the townspeople, in outlandish, unintelligible words, that no earthly affliction ever equaled what had befallen them. Man's brotherhood with man was sufficient to make the New Englanders understand this language. The strangers wanted food. Some of them sought hospitality at the doors of the stately mansions, which then stood in the vicinity of Hanover Street and the North Square. Others were applicants at the humble wooden tenements, where dwelt the petty shop-keepers and mechanics. Pray heaven, that no family in Boston turned one of these poor exiles from their door. It would be a reproach upon New England, a crime worthy of heavy retribution, if the aged women and children, or even the strong men, were allowed to feel the pinch of hunger. Perhaps some of the Acadians, in their aimless wanderings through the town, found themselves near a large brick edifice, which was fenced in from the street by an iron railing, wrought with fantastic figures. They saw a flight of red freestone steps, ascending to a portal, above which was a balcony and balustrade. Misery and desolation give men the right of free passage everywhere. Let us suppose, then, that they mounted the flight of steps, and passed into the province house. Making their way into one of the apartments, they beheld a richly clad gentleman, seated in a stately chair, with gilding upon the carved work of its back, and a gilded lion's head at the summit. This was Governor Shirley, meditating upon matters of war and state, in grandfather's chair. If such an incident did happen, Shirley, reflecting what a ruin of peaceful and humble hopes had been wrought by the cold policy of the statesman, and the iron hand of the warrior, might have drawn a deep moral from it. It should have taught him that the poor man's hearth is sacred, and that armies and nations have no right to violate it. It should have made him feel, that England's triumph, and increased dominion, could not compensate to mankind, nor atone to heaven, for the ashes of a single Acadian cottage. But it is not thus that statesmen and warriors moralize. "Grandfather," cried Lawrence, with emotion trembling in his voice, "did iron-hearted war itself ever do so hard and cruel a thing as this before? You have read in history, Lawrence, of whole regions wantonly laid waste," said grandfather. In the removal of the Acadians, the troops were guilty of no cruelty or outrage, except what was inseparable from the measure. Little Alice, whose eyes had, all along, been brimming full of tears, now burst forth a sobbing, for grandfather had touched her sympathies more than he intended. "To think of a whole people, homeless in the world," said Clara, with moistened eyes. "There never was anything so sad, it was their own fault," cried Charlie, energetically. "Why did not they fight for the country where they were born? Then, if the worst had happened to them they could only have been killed and buried there. They would not have been exiles then, certainly, their lot was as hard as death," said grandfather. "All that could be done for them, in the English provinces, was to send them to the almshouses, or bind them out to taskmasters. And this was the fate of persons, who had possessed a comfortable property in their native country. Some of them found means to embark for France, but though it was the land of their forefathers, it must have been a foreign land to them. Those, who remained behind, always cherished a belief, that the King of France would never make peace with England, till his poor Acadians were restored their country and their homes. And did he?" inquired Clara.